Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversation with everyday folks about the mystery of life. This podcast is a complement to the Numinous School, an online intuition development course for people who want their self-awareness to serve a greater good. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, and this week my guest is Rachelle Lamb. I first met Rachelle when I attended one of her workshops in nonviolent communication. Since then, we've discovered that we both really enjoy exploring language, relating, and conflict through the lens of cultural anthropology, spirituality, and more. I caught up with Rachelle over Skype. She was at home in Victoria, BC. So, Rachelle, what was going on in your life when you first discovered Marshall Rosenberg's work around nonviolent communication, which is also called compassionate communication?
Well, I was married. I had 2 children, and I believe at the time they would have been about 8 years old and 12 years old. I was doing my best to be a good parent, to be a good wife, if there are such terms that could be applied, and just struggling with the mayhem of living in a nuclear family in a mad society. Yeah, that's what was going on in my life.
Were you aware that it was a mad society, or was this more like a free-floating kind of vague divine discontent of like what's going on, or were you kind of clear?
I was pretty clear. I've had that awareness since I was about 7 years old.
Okay, well, let's define the terms then, because it's obviously very clear to you. So what do you mean by mad society?
Well, what I mean is that I'm not sure, or I do feel pretty sure that the way in which we've constructed our lives and our world is not really attuned with what I would call the natural world. And just the fact that we have our lights on until midnight or 1 a.m. at this time of year, which is we're now in January, that we're so out of sync with the natural way of things. And I think that the repercussion of being out of sync with the natural way of things is that we become oblivious to the fact that we're out of sync. And in that out of syncness, we experience, I guess, feelings of being cut off somehow, of not belonging. I think the theme of not belonging is a very big theme in people's lives. And I think the reason that feeling comes up is because we're not attuned with our, what I would call a natural human rhythm. And my parents, bless them, would order, we had National Geographics coming to our home regularly, and I was very inquisitive. I still remain inquisitive, and I would go through the magazines and find myself really drawn to photographs of people living in different cultures, especially ones that were living tribally. And I was struck by their faces. There was just this incredible, what I would call depth in the eyes, and a smile that really lit up, and all of that in spite of the fact that their lives seemed to be quite difficult. They seemed to be pretty much concentrated on how to survive in the world. But I'm saying difficult. I don't know that they would agree that it was difficult, but we here would agree that it is, because we've become so accustomed to certain comforts, and we have very, very high expectations, and those expectations, I think, get passed on in our relationships, and that's how we end up speaking to each other in ways that I think are really alienating for ourselves and others. For instance, is just you've probably heard this saying, and it's a First Nations saying, and probably all Indigenous cultures might say this, is that what you call natural resources, we call relatives. And I think that says a lot. So our treatment of natural resources and our treatment of human resources is pretty much the same. And we've become quite used to the idea that we should orient our lives to what works for us personally as human beings. and it's sold to us on a regular basis on the bookshelves. You can have everything you want. You can do everything you want. If you dream it, you can do it. That kind of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a fairly lengthy answer to your question.
No, it's great.
Yeah,
Okay, so yeah, it really gets at the marrow of the issue. And I think why
yeah,
you and I really connect on this stuff is because when you're talking about alienation, on that sort of cultural scale, I I see it. I know what you're talking about when you say at the personal level, we don't feel like we belong in our own life. And so
mhm,
it comes out in how we communicate with the people that are supposed to be our most intimate, tribe mates. These are the people upon whom we should rely. And it's hard to feel trust in that when you are completely alienated on, physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels. So let's go. Okay, so bring me back to you're in the nuclear world. You
yeah.
come across nonviolent communication. You come across Marshall Rosenberg's work, and what does it look like the day that you say to your family, "I'm doing this," and what are you telling them and yourself about why you're doing it?
Well, I read Rosenberg's book in 2 or 3 days. I couldn't put it down because very early on, chapter one, it was clear to me that although I wouldn't at the time have called myself a violent communicator, I've never been known that way, is that I recognized that there are ways that they're quite insidious, ways that we have been enculturated to speak that are, in fact, quite alienating. And so we'll use the word violent because they push away what we're actually deeply longing for. And it's in the speech. And since we all learn to speak before we learn to think and discern, there's some inherent problems with that. So we're at the mercy as children. Um, we're at the mercy of the caregivers. What's their skill level when they're teaching us? And when you're living in a culture that's really based on growth, progress, and acquisition, the language reflects it as
Mm-hmm.
well. So our language is as sharply angled and concrete and as the materials that surround us. Often, we don't live in most of our homes are constructed in a particular way, and they're they're hard, and so the language takes on the same qualities. I know that may sound like a far-fetched idea, but I would ask people to entertain the possibility of that,
Mm-hmm.
that our speech is impoverished,
Mm-hmm.
in fact. So nonviolent communication is one of the tools that I use, and it is such an incredible tool. The other tool that I use is poetry. I would
Mm-hmm.
say I don't even like to call it a tool because
Yeah, yeah.
that connects with it. But I would say the other approach. David White, the poet, has said that poetry is the language against which we have no defenses. And so I'm teaching nonviolent communication. I'm also bringing in a lot of poetry. I'm also bringing in that cultural piece and bringing in mythology as well and storytelling. I think we're starving for that. And I think in our relationships, people will often say, we'll say a couple where it's typically in couples, it's the woman who's yearning for a deeper level of connection with her man. And the way she goes about doing it, she might say something like, hey, how come you're always at the office? How come I never see you anymore? Now, can you hear in that? There's a kind of tonal quality
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't draw the man to her.
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
it's
It's kind of blamey.
it is kind of blamey for sure. So if she were to turn to him and instead say something like, I really miss you, you know, I've noticed that I've really been missing you lately. And that has a much different quality where it really kind of catches your attention.
It
Now,
really does.
yeah,
It hurts my heart. My heart is wincing right now because I don't hear myself say that enough. I don't think my husband and I have a typical relationship in that same way, but I hear the accusing tonal quality when I'm trying to actually create connection, and it comes across as blamey, and I don't hear myself be vulnerable in that way enough, I would say, where it's like, here's the need underneath that is I miss you and I want connection. And actually, before we go on, that reminds me of something, because the first time that I met you, my husband and I were taking your Speak to Me Like You Love Me workshop. And we thought we were pretty hot shit, because we were doing this as like a preemptive move, because we just didn't really argue. But we thought that, we had decided we were going to get married, and we should probably kind of have a framework or a structure that was shared. We weren't totally young, so we thought, well, let's start fresh in our communication. We're going to create a shared language and system for communication when we do have conflict. And of course, what happened was we had a massive blow up the night before.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And so, very in this like sort of rare event, we showed up in sort of this icy atmosphere around us going to it. And this was the first time that I'd ever heard the poetry of John O'Donohue. And I actually want to read it because I have his book now right beside me. So this is like years ago. You read For Love in a Time of Conflict. And it goes like this. When the gentleness between you hardens and you fall out of your belonging with each other, may the depths you have reached hold you still. When no true word can be said or heard, and you mirror each other in the script of hurt, when even the silence has become raw and torn, may you hear again an echo of your first music. When the weave of affection starts to unravel and anger begins to sear the ground between you, before this weather of grief invites the black seed of bitterness to find root, may your souls come to kiss. Now is the time. Now is the time for one of you to be gracious, to allow a kindness beyond thought and hurt, to reach out with sure hands to take the chalice of your love and carry it carefully through this echoless waste until this winter pilgrimage leads you toward the gateway to spring. Oh, see, it takes me to that moment of being in your workshop, and you read it, and all my defenses dissolved because I have no defense against that. It was so connecting, and as the Quakers would say, that friend speaks my mind.
Yeah.
It was just beautiful. And so now that I'm thinking about your workshop, I'm going to kind of switch into that, because, okay, so you embark upon this as career work. You're doing these amazing workshops. And one of the things that you're really good at is role play. Like, I hate workshops because I hate role play. I hate that kind of thing. I will not participate. And what you do is somebody will ask a question and you sort of know what they're getting at, and you just slip into character as the person that they're arguing with. It's a bit disarming. Like, so I might say something like, well, my mom never listens to me. When she calls me, she'll talk to an hour and never ask me a question. And then you'll just kind of like switch into the role of a mother. And you I was like, I'm not going to do this with you. And you wouldn't stop. You just like kept kind of egging me on until finally I was like, well, God, I can't even stand. Like, you're really good at that. So that's not something you can learn in a book or even, really training with Marshall Rosenberg. Like, why do you think you're so good at slipping into character and drawing out these kinds of behaviors that, like, I don't really want to share in a workshop with strangers. I don't want them to see the lesser part of me that's violent. Why are you good at that? How are you good at that?
It seems to be an intuitive thing that I have inside of me. And I don't know how how it is that I have that skill. I recognize that I do have it. There's, plenty of people have commented on it. I think that just in the moment when somebody asks me the question, I recognize that the deeper learning will come from us absolutely fully immersing ourselves in that moment. And I just find it comes from somewhere. It just arises in me, and suddenly I'll be saying, "All right, daughter, could you tell me what it is exactly that I say to you?" And the next thing you know, we're in it. And it's not uncommon, as you probably witnessed at the time, where someone will say, "How did you know that about them? How could you know them so well?" And I would say the answer to that question is that I uh, I was very shy as a child. People will probably find this surprising because I appear to be quite gregarious, but I'm actually quite a private person, and I pretty much I was very quiet until I got married, and that I can't explain. But when I got married at 25 years old, everything changed,
Mm.
and I think I felt much more secure in myself to be with somebody. But so during that first, 25 years of my life, I found myself being a very astute observer, and I would pull back and just watch. And I do find that people are quite predictable, in fact. There are, ways of speaking that will elicit pretty, uh, consistent responses from other people.
Mm.
For instance, I've never found that if I say, "Wow, you're so selfish," that the other person says, "Oh, wow, what can I do to change that?" They get defensive. So I recognize the patterns of defensiveness that arise. And I also do like acting. I like performance. I like storytelling. So all of those things, I think, have just been conducive to my ability to step into role play
So
like
you've
that.
talked about storytelling twice now. What's important about storytelling to you?
I think what's important about it is that it describes landscape. When you're listening to an amazing story being told, uh, it's usually very animated, and the person is describing the terrain. There are these, just when the person looked around, they looked into the horizon, and all they could see were rolling green hills for miles, and the clouds in one area where the sunlight was spilling down onto this small field where there was a little house with the smoke curling up from the chimney, and they could see a pasture where there were a few cows grazing. And the person who had been traveling for so long knew in that moment that they absolutely had to head in that direction. So what I've just said is kind of illustrative of that, is to
Yeah.
the ability to be able to describe a landscape. I think it does us an enormous it's of great benefit to us to approach it in that way, because otherwise we're only ever really speaking about our own starvation, and
Mm.
um, and I want my needs to be met, and I'm feeling angry, and I have a need for this, and it really starts to sound like a demand. And now we're turning people into human resources.
Mm.
I'm trying to invite people or get them to see what would be happening if they could speak about what's going on in a different way, which does mean to describe where you're standing,
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that I mean, that just came to me right now. That.
Oh, no, I get it. It's beautiful. And I feel like I'm standing on the hillside looking down at the pasture with the house and the chimney. It's
Yeah,
like, yes, I
yeah.
accept your invitation. I want to go there. It's so clear that poetry influences, maybe informs your work.
Mhm.
And I remember seeing a post come through Facebook from the poetess and being like, wow, that was really beautiful. Great share, Rachelle. And then it took me a while to realize that's you.
That's me.
Oh, that's so great.
Yeah.
So poetry is, yeah, I don't want to say it's a tool. It's more like medicine. What is it for you? And how
It's
did you get the courage to now, something happens at 25, you're more vocal, but I think poetry, that's next level to share that with the world. Can you just take me into that a little bit? What the poetry as the poetess, what that means for you?
mm. Well, I have found poetry to be soul food and soul medicine. And David White has a poem called Loaves and Fishes, which is one I often recite at the beginning of a workshop. And what he says is, this is not the age of information. This is not the age of information. Forget the news and the radio and the blurred screen. This is a time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry, and one good word is bread for 1,000. Now, when we speak, we don't usually consider our words as a form of nutrition, but I would say that indeed they are. And so our speech has the capacity to either lay the table for a grand feast or to create famine. And we know what that's like to be on the receiving end as well as the giving end of those two ways of speaking. So there's an enormous generosity that can come through when we start to explore poetry, because poetry is very has a certain eye for detail that gets missed in what I would say in technology, in our speed. I mean, you can't tweet it, you know, and you wouldn't want to, because we deserve more than that. It's it's much deeper, it's much broader, and it misses so many of the nuances. And yet we often fall for it. We go, wow, it's so great that I can do this, in just a few words I can get a message out to the world. But Marshall McLuhan had said the medium is the message. And so poetry carries enormous capacity to reflect and reveal the human condition and speak to it in a way that's not trying to fix it or medicate it, but just recognize it. Life is hard, you know. Life is really hard. It's full of heartbreak, and poetry speaks to it with just enormous grace and beauty and eloquence, and that's why I think it's important. I think it's really important, and so I've just find myself gravitating to that more and more. It's I don't call myself strictly a nonviolent communication trainer anymore. It's one of the lenses. I'm using a lens of cultural anthropology, of mythology, of deep ecology as well. Because I think that what's happening for us and between human beings is a reflection of how we treat the planet.
Okay, so Rachelle, you've walked down into that valley to that little house with the smoke curling out of the chimney, and it's been a hard journey. And it's the gloaming time. It's just about evening, and you open the door and go in, and there by the fire, drinking a little dram, are three people who are deft and refined with the word, and you get to spend the night with them. Who are you going to drink by the fire with?
What a beautiful question. Well, I think I'm going to say John O'Donohue.
May he rest in peace.
Yes, because I never met the man, but I love the way he speaks about beauty and the soul, and he has a beautiful way with language, and it also has got a great deal of reference to soil, to earth, to that kind of loamy magic. I'm also going to say my mother, because my mother died when I was 21 years old. And she really was instrumental in sort of having me walk this path. And it's been a long time since I've seen her, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember her beautiful voice. She loved people like William Blake. She was a gypsy in her heart, and a spiritual one at that. So she would be one of those people, and I find myself gravitating towards the dead here
Mm-hmm.
because because there's a good chance that amongst the living I'll be able to sit down with these people, or at least I imagine in my best moments that I could. I think the third person might be my great grandfather, who I only ever heard stories of, and was a Welshman and also a writer. He was a coal miner for most of his life, from the age of 13 to about 73. And in spite of that, he wrote things. He was something of what I would say, a social commentator, as
Mm-hmm.
well as a poet and a lover of the land. And when I read some of his writing, I recognized that, well, I surely am his great granddaughter. So I'd really love to meet him. Yeah.
Oh, and then I want to be the servant girl who keeps filling your glasses that night.
That would be great. Bring on the mead.
That's right. Okay, last question. It's a traditional one for the Numinous podcast. Rachelle, what do you consider perfect happiness?
Mm. Oh boy. Well, I could probably describe a scene in heaven, but since I'm not a strong believer in that kind of life, I would say that hmm, what comes up in my mind is that little home with the smoke curling out of the chimney.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's that sense of belonging that I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
Living in a time where my son lives in Ottawa, and my daughter is here in Victoria, and my son recently got married and is will probably have children at some point, and so the distance between him and me and
Mm.
his possible family. So for me, it really does have a strong sense of family bound to it. A perfect happy day.
Mm.
Um, but I'm going to throw a funeral in there too, which may
Mm.
sound odd, because I find that when we allow um, death to be closer to us instead of pushing it away,
Mhm.
it has a way of making us recognize how short our time is here, how enormously precious it is. And for me, that is happiness, is to just
Mhm.
see the way that it is, and to say yes to it, to say yes to the heartbreak and to the whole thing. And you mentioned, Carmen, that my post on Poetess, and I'm wondering if I could share it,
Yes, do,
um,
do.
because what I'd written in it just seemed to really touch a chord inside of many people's hearts. Was this: May you fall madly in love this year, in love with someone who unhinges your tired trajectory, in love with a spouse of several years who might be aching for lightning, in love with demanding children and crazy relatives, in love with the particular pedigree of genius insanity that has perhaps claimed you in spite of your reluctance, and certainly in love with an animal, a cloud, a redwood, the wild, these at least once a day. May you fall in love with this fragile jewel of a world, with hard work, real learning, just causes, petitioning, and prayers. May you fall in love with wonder itself, with the grand mystery, with all that feeds you in order that you may live, and with the responsibility that that confers. May you fall in love with heartbreak and seeing how it's stitched into everything. May you fall in love with the natural order of things and with tears, tenderness, and humility. May this be a magnificent year for you. May you fall deeply, madly, hopelessly, inextinguishably in love.
Oh, Rachelle. I'm in love with the jewel of you. Thank you so much for sharing that on the show. I love that you're here, and I love talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing today.
Well, the pleasure is mine equally. Yeah, it's been wonderful speaking with you, Carmen.
Poetry, man, it gets me every time. I don't know about you, but I really thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. I could listen to Rachelle and her vivid imagery for hours. I want to thank Rachelle for coming on the show, and thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate your review on iTunes, and I want to thank a listener in Finland with a very long number ending in 383 who said, "I love it." Enough said. Thank you so much. I love Finland. And if you enjoyed this show, please share it far and wide, because you never know who needs to hear it right now. If you'd like to find out more about Rachelle, you can just go to my show notes on my website, carmenspagnola.com, CarmenSpagnola, and just click the link for the podcast in the upper right corner. While you're there, sign up for my monthly email newsletter. You'll instantly receive a meditation download, and you'll get something free from me every month. Until next time, I just want to say hello to my listeners in England, Ireland, and Wales, and I really look forward to connecting with you again. Take care.